You can't live in this world today and not be curious. In fact, if ever there was a time to hear from more than the usual suspects, it's now. This is the Carlos Watson Show. Maybe we'll surprise you. Maybe you'll be mad at us sometimes, or inspired. Not only do I hope people will see more with the show, but I hope they'll do more and be more. People, the good stuff starts now.
You want to change the world, there's some really simple things you need to do.
One of my favorite conversations ever. Give me maybe the most interesting person you've ever met.
I feel like if I don't find you interesting, that's my fault.
With one of the greatest thinkers of our time.
How is it possible that something that seems like a disability could prove to be an advantage?
Malcolm Gladwell tells me about the country's low point.
Whether or not some white person uses the N-word to a black person, I care less. Never got tickets before. Black men in America, this is not news.
And his fan highlights?
I love what you do, bro!
Malcolm, welcome to the show. I smile every time I see you, although it's been a long time since I've seen you, given COVID.
Yes.
Normally we would be in the New York summer heat around right now. We'd be at OZY Fest.
I know, it's so sad.
Where are you quarantining during this interesting time?
I'm in upstate New York, about 2 hours north of the city, in the Hudson Valley.
I was going to ask you, happily, or are you stir crazy at this point?
No, I'm managing. I think I've been busy, so I've kept myself from going too crazy.
Are you writing more these days? Are you recording more these days, given all that you're doing in the podcast world? How are you spending the bulk of your time these days?
Well, I've just finished just today, I recorded the last episode of this season of Revisionist History. So this whole time I've been occupied with getting this season out the door. My name is Malcolm Gladwell, and you're listening to Revisionist History, a podcast about revisiting the past. And now I'll be working on another audiobook project for the rest of the summer.
Malcolm, take me way back. What was young Malcolm like? If I had bumped into young Malcolm at 8, 9, 10, like who would I have met? Would he have had the same great hair? Would he have had the same kind of whimsical nature? Who would I have met? And where would I have met him, by the way?
You would have met me in rural Ontario, about an hour and a half outside Toronto. You know, I grew up in quite a secluded, quiet part of the world, a long way from any kind of big city sophistication. I was a pretty nerdy kid. Didn't have a television at home. Didn't really know much about pop culture. Didn't participate in some typical activities of someone that age. We lived in a kind of farming community it's like a little bubble, you know. And by the way, I enjoyed every minute of it. I'm not dissing it. I loved it, and I would wish it on anyone. But I wasn't one of those jaded New York City kids. I was a little skinny kid who spent most of his time reading history books, playing war games, running around. I was just a couple years later, I started to become a very serious runner. If you'd met me at 14, I would have told you I was a runner. I would have identified wholly with my status as an athlete.
And who were your parents? Again, set the scene a little bit for us. So we're in rural Ontario, lots of books, no television, so that is clearly a signifier there. Who were the parents in this house?
My dad was a mathematician at the local university, Englishman, big beard, loved dogs, gardening, long walks. My mom is Jamaican. She was a writer, and then she was a psychotherapist who had a local family therapy practice in town. Both very religious, and I had a very untroubled adolescence and childhood, and a very untroubled relationship with my parents. Even if I were not their child, I would have been their friend. My dad was a very kind of quirky, eccentric, just delightful human being. I mean, he died a couple years ago, and my mom is still going strong and is one of those indomitable Jamaican ladies. I feel like if a nuclear bomb dropped on the world, the only people who would survive would be Jamaican ladies, and they would single-handedly resurrect civilization. I don't think, kind of impossible to to defeat them, to discourage them, to stop them in any way. That's my mom.
I love hearing you say that. I come from similar stock, and so I have a deep appreciation for what you're saying on many, many levels. How did you end up, Malcolm, becoming a journalist? In other words, would you have also told me that at 14, that you were on a path towards journalism, or did that come along later in the story?
I became a journalist by chance. I was planning to go first to law school, then I was going to go to business school, and then I decided before I went to business school I would go into advertising, but I couldn't get a job. And then I, by sheerest chance, got a job at some obscure little magazine in the States, moved down here, and just stayed. I freelanced for a while, lived in Washington, D.C., worked for the Washington Post, moved to New York, got a job at the New Yorker. I never planned any of it. It's been a totally serendipitous journey.
Am I right that you have a broader audience than some might expect, or is your audience probably maybe more, what would I say, more New Yorker?
I used to think that my audience was quite narrow. You can fall into this mistake of thinking, I'm really writing for someone who's an upper middle class professional, highly educated, 40-year-old living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, right? That's the trap you fall into. You think, that's who they are. That's who's reading my stuff. That's who I should pitch to. I have noticed the people who give me props on the street are overwhelmingly young black guys. I don't know why, but that's who comes up to me in the street. And the best example was once I was running down Ocean Drive or Avenue in Santa Monica, and there's a guy in I'm a huge car person, I love cars. A guy in this exquisite, tricked out Porsche 911 with the big open sunroof. And he's this young, totally buff, insanely handsome black guy. He sees me and he stands up in his seat and he goes, "I love what you do, bro." My favorite moment ever.
Malcolm, I'm intrigued about what has driven you to write the books you've written. Will you take us through that? What led you to write Blink? What led you to write some of the other books?
It's always some little trivial thing that sets me off. With Blink, I decided in the late 90s, early aughts, I had worn my hair really short, and I had a full-on afro for a while, a really big one. And I started to get stopped by cops, stopped at airports, and I just realized all of a sudden I was much more identifiably a person of color. I mean, I'm not, I'm pretty light-skinned, but when I have a huge afro, it's and the whole world was treating me differently. I cannot tell you how many tickets I got in a 5-year span when I grew my hair. I mean, I never got tickets before. And I realized this is, for black men in America, this is not news. But I hadn't been treated that way until that moment. I had my hair all short and tidy. And then boom. And I just thought, that just made me realize, I thought it'd be really interesting to write a book about the power of first impressions. By power, I don't mean how good they are. I mean how consequential they are. Outliers came next. And that was a book because I literally was at a fancy dinner party in Manhattan and sitting next to some rich white guy who grew up on the Upper East Side in some fancy apartment, whose father was an investment banker. And he was making this argument about how he was a self-made man. His success was all due to his own hard work and intelligence, which was so self-evidently nonsense that I just thought, let's write a book about how the myth of the self-made man is an illusion, that try and puncture that particular myth in American society. I started meeting all these very successful entrepreneurs who were dyslexic. And when you asked them about it, they would always say that they thought they were successful not in spite of their dyslexia, but because of it, which I just thought was such a fascinating observation. And David and Goliath is basically an examination of that idea. How is it possible that something that seems like a disability could prove to be an advantage? And then my last book, Talking to Strangers, is just about me watching that Sandra Bland video over and over again.
You just opened my car door, so you threatening to drag me out of my own car. Get out of the car!
And getting angry. At seeing the tragedy and the stupidity and the absurdity of a young Black woman being pulled out of her car for nothing, and then ending up dead in her cell 2 days later.
Black Lives Matter.
They always start with some little precipitating incident in my life which affects me in some way.
The "You've been dreaming about this car since you were 8" policy from American Family Insurance.
I so love that, Malcolm, and I so appreciate the backstory on each of those. It's interesting. It is difficult, even tragic things that motivate you in each of these 5 cases to do the work. What does that tell you that's the thing that is moving you to do the work that's required to write a really special book?
Books are often born in emotional responses. You have to feel something. If you write a book, you spend years with it. And if all you have is some kind of idle curiosity, you're gonna lose steam halfway through. But if you're being fueled by something more important than that, then I think you have a shot at making a go of the book.
Malcolm, talk to me a little bit about Black Lives Matter and the conversation around race that we're in right now. Not only how you see what's happening now, but where do you expect this to go?
I feel like maybe finally we're taking this issue seriously, although never underestimate the ability of American society to trivialize an important conversation. One thing that kind of depresses me is there are 2 conversations you can have about race. There's the personal conversation. Are white people and Black people nice to each other? And then there's the structural conversation, which is, are the systems by which we run our society fair or are they biased? Those are separate conversations. And in this country, what we have done is we have used the first conversation, the personal conversation, to get out of our obligations to have the second conversation. And we've tried to pretend that if we're nice to each other, then all of the other stuff doesn't matter. And I have the opposite position. I care less whether white people are nice to Black people or vice versa. To my mind, all that matters is that the society, the fundamental structure of the society, be fair. Voter suppression, redlining, reparations, legacies of Jim Crow, employment opportunity, I could go on. Whether or not some white person uses the N-word to a Black person, I care less. It's not important. What matters to me are these big, serious issues that have a permanent and profound effect on the fortunes of an entire population.
And how would you go about doing that? It's funny, Malcolm, there are times when I wonder whether we would do well to almost sum it up and create a new constitutional convention, to almost say, to your point, that systems matter and that let's talk about the fundamental rules and the fundamental systems, and almost as if you were kind of restarting or refreshing a company, right? That you would kind of have a foundational reset. Crazy idea, better ways to do it? Like, how would we go about thinking about and truly trying to move forward on some of this systemic change that I think I hear you saying is what matters?
You want to change the world, there's some really simple things you need to do. And that is, once you put people who think a little differently and have different priorities in positions of power, they will make different decisions. If we change the complexion of what the elite in this country looks like, then you change the power dynamics within the country. You can have all kinds of complicated arguments about police reform, but you start by making sure that your police force reflects the community they are policing. I wish, before we get into some of these more complicated longer term stuff, let's just go through a concerted period where we just change the composition of people in positions of power. And that's a really, really, really good start.
And so, Malcolm, what do your wealthy, white, liberal friends, who I know love you, and I know read all your books, what do they say when you say this to them? Because they're the very people who have the ability to make these changes, right? They're the CEOs, they own the hedge funds, they're the people who could decide tonight that tomorrow I'm gonna meaningfully integrate my senior team, my board, et cetera. I'm gonna put someone in place, as Malcolm is recommending, who's immediately gonna make change. What do they say when you say this to them?
Ultimately, what you got to talk about is you got to talk about making sure that if you want more black dentists, you got to make sure that there are more black people applying to dentist school, which means you got to have more kids who are taking, more black kids who are taking science in college, which means you got a better preparation in high school, which means, you can play that game, and that's important. Harvard University, if you look at the number, what are the most favored categories for admission? Partly it's kids who do really well on their test scores, but there's a huge category of kids who get in because their parents went there, or their parents gave a lot of money, or they're athletes. And by athletes, we mean like sailing and fencing and all those other sports which are set up to reward, and lacrosse, the kids who went to fancy private schools. Like, the system, it's not rigged, but it was organized to give a special benefit to a certain class of privileged kids. Like, it's not like it's some perfect meritocracy.
Malcolm, one of the things that we're trying to help people do is thinking about dreaming big and dreaming fearlessly. I feel like so much of your writing, or at least certainly a lot of what happened in The Tipping Point, I felt like was about how people not only dream, but realize those dreams. What else have you learned, and what else can you share about how to both dream well and bring those dreams alive?
One of my favorite thinkers, an economist named Albert Hirschman. So he had this insane life where he traveled around the world, and during the Second World War, he saved all of these Jewish people from the Holocaust, and he went on to be this brilliant scholar. And at every turn, whenever he was faced with a major life decision, he would always make the crazy choice. Because his point was, I don't know whether this is actually a crazy choice, because I can't predict the future, right? And I find that was my father's life philosophy, and I find it an incredibly powerful notion.
I so love that. Make the crazy choice. I feel like that should be a t-shirt. A few final questions. We'll do a little bit of a hot round here. Most interesting or favorite place in the world you've ever had a chance to visit?
Johannesburg.
Because?
If you go to a nice restaurant in Johannesburg and half, if not more, the people, 3/4 of the people in the room will be black. This is one generation after apartheid. Didn't have a revolution. Nobody got shot. My hat is off to them. That's Nelson Mandela, man. That is some insane magic that you can do that in one generation.
Are you a romantic?
Am I a romantic? A little bit, sure. I mean, I'm half English. That limits the extent to which I can describe myself as being a romantic.
Are we going to see Malcolm Gladwell married in the future?
I would say your odds are much better than 50%. Much better.
Oh, I kind of like hearing that. Is this new? Is it?
That's all I'm saying.
Okay. I always enjoy spending time with you. Always, always, always. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Carlos.
Hey, that was Malcolm Gladwell. You see what we're doing here. Gonna give you provocative conversations every time. We'll see you next time. Hey, tune into the Carlos Watson Show. It's like no other. You're gonna enjoy it every weekday on YouTube.